Excellencies, and diplomats from many countries on 4 continents, guest speakers, members, and friends of the Schiller Institute, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this seminar sponsored by the Schiller Institutes in Denmark and Sweden, which is also being live streamed on YouTube. The title is, "We Need a New International Security and Development Architecture, Not a Strengthening of Geopolitical Blocs. No in the Danish Referendum on the EU military arm, and no to Sweden and Finland joining NATO." I am Michelle Rasmussen, the Vice President of the Schiller Institute in Denmark, and I will be the moderator today. After the start of the war in Ukraine, a dramatic shift in defense policy has been proposed in 3 of the Nordic countries. Denmark is having a referendum on June 1st about joining the EU's military activities, and Sweden's and Finland's governments want to join NATO. We think that it's necessary to discuss these issues from a higher standpoint. Our keynote speaker, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, stated on May 19th that this is the most dangerous moment in world history. There is war in Europe, and many experts are warning that if the war were not ended soon and a diplomatic solution crafted, and if those advocating increasing the geopolitical confrontation were not politically defeated, the war could escalate to even nuclear war. At the same time, the world economy is in crisis. While the dangers are great, there is hope because there are solutions in the form of a new security and development architecture, including proposals by the late Lyndon LaRouche, the founder of our political movement, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and the Schiller Institute, for a security agreement modeled on the Peace of Westphalia, combined with increased economic development cooperation between countries. We have called this meeting to discuss, 1, what caused the current extremely dangerous military and economic crisis? 2, why strengthening the EU military arm with Danish participation and Sweden and Finland joining NATO would only exacerbate geopolitical conflict? And 3, what are the principles upon which we can create a new security and development architecture for the benefit of all nations? We want to ensure that both the dangers and solutions are known, and that an effective movement is built to stop a further escalation of this war and its economic effects, and prevent future wars and economic destruction. Somehow, humanity must create the conditions where war is not an option in this era of nuclear weapons. The format for today is that the speeches will be interspersed with 3 discussion periods. After the first speaker, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, after our 3 guest speakers, Jørgen Nielsen, Jan Erber, and Li Xing, and after Ulf Sandmark, the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Sweden, and short remarks by myself standing in for Tom Gillesberg, chairman of the Schiller Institute in Denmark, who could not be with us today. You may ask a question or comment yourself, or by writing them to me. If you want to ask a question or comment yourself, please click the raised hand icon at the bottom of your screen. If you want me to ask a question or comment or state your comment, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and write it there. If you do not want me to state your name, please write no name. I will repeat this before the question periods. Let us now hear from our speakers, whom I thank all very much for taking the time to be with us. The first speaker is Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute. She is also the editor-in-chief of Executive Intelligence Review, chairwoman of the German political party BÜSO, Civil Rights Movement Solidarity, and she was the wife and closest collaborator of the late American economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. Among many other things, Helga Zepp-LaRouche led a movement for East-West economic development cooperation after the fall of the Berlin Wall and collapse of the Soviet Union, first called the Eurasian Land Bridge or the New Silk Road, and then expanded to become the World Land Bridge. Helga, we are very happy that you are able to speak to us today.
Hello, good day, ladies and gentlemen. As Michelle just said, I have stated that we are facing the most dangerous crisis in the history of mankind. Now, why am I saying that? Obviously, that includes 2 world wars in the 20th century, the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it's a big order. Well, the first reason is the most obvious. For the very first time, we are facing the real danger of a global nuclear war. And if it would ever come to that, it would for sure mean the annihilation of the human species. In the recent period, the illusion has developed that a limited nuclear war can be fought and won, or that protracted hybrid nuclear conventional war can take place. This was the subject in a maneuver in January of this year called Global Lightning, which had this idea that you have some nuclear bombs, neutron bombs, space war, cyber war, and this would go on for weeks. Now, the famous nuclear arms specialist, former MIT professor Ted Postol, has developed all the arguments why this is completely ludicrous, that why if one only uses one single nuclear weapon, it is the logic of nuclear war that all will be used. In the recent months, since the war in Ukraine started, you hear from all kinds of politicians and journalists and who knows who else, reckless talk, saying things like, well, even if there is the risk of nuclear war, we have to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. We can't be blackmailed, or it won't happen because nobody will be so foolish to do this. Well, I don't think that that is a convincing argument. The second reason why I'm saying that we are in the worst crisis ever is that we experience a civilizational breakdown and the end of an entire system. Now, this has many elements. We have the immediate danger of an escalation of the war as a result of the present chicken game policies conducted by NATO against Russia. We are facing a hyperinflationary blowout of the Western neoliberal financial system, which was long in process even before the war in Ukraine started. We are looking at a world famine, which according to the United Nations is threatening 1.7 billion people with starvation. That is 20% of the entire human species. The pandemic is not over, and all of this is threatening social chaos as a result, and that chaos all by itself could threaten, could plunge the world into a war. If one listens to the Western media and all kinds of politicians, it is naturally all to be blamed on Putin. He is being given all possible names right now, that he has caused an unprovoked war of aggression, that he is responsible for world famine, that he is the cause of inflation, and so forth and so on. If any argument for the causes of the present situation, if you say any argument for the real causes of the present situation, you are immediately accused of fake news, you are called a Putin agent, it is denounced as Russian propaganda. Well, it has very little to do with Ukraine. In reality, this present confrontation is about the world order. It is the fight between an unipolar world, which is really a world empire based on the US-British special relationship, whereby the Anglo-American hegemon insists that only the so-called rules-based order which they have defined is valid, versus a world in which the rise of China and countries associated with Russia and China insist on their own right for economic development. We are right now at the most precarious moment. The neoliberal system is collapsing. It is not strong enough anymore to enforce its will, but the new order is not yet clearly defined. Naturally, in the officially allowed discussion, it is being said that this is a fight between the democracies and the autocratic regimes. Well, right now, if you listen to what certain politicians and people like Stoltenberg are saying, we are heading towards a potential total decoupling between the West, plus the Five Eyes, plus Japan, Australia, and South Korea, versus a part of the world which includes China, Russia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, plus many countries who are now trying to become part of the BRICS, which is most of the global South. In frantic trips, Blinken is running around the world trying to convince people to join the faction of the democracies. But President Biden right now is in Asia doing the same thing. Chancellor Scholz just went to Africa, von der Leyen to India, all in an effort to isolate Russia and China, but it's not working. Because India, Indonesia, Brazil, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, and many others do not want to be pulled into a geopolitical confrontation between the two sides. And what we are actually experiencing is a real renaissance of the non-aligned movement. Well, we should not overlook, given the American policies, the role of the British, which is global Britain, which is really a new word for the British Empire, which, contrary to the views of many, has only changed its shape, but not its essence. Take, for example, an article by Malcolm Chalmers, Deputy Director General of the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, which happens to be the oldest official think tank associated with the royal household and the British military. They are describing themselves as the world's oldest and UK leading defense and security think tank. They are proposing a, quote, Cuban Missile Crisis on steroid, which could result over the Ukrainian attempt to retake Crimea, which would make it easier, in their view, to settle the US-Ukraine war. And this is the stunning proposition in this article, which has the headline, "This war still presents nuclear risks, especially in relation to Crimea," which was published on May 20th by the RUSI think tank. Chalmers discusses how Russia could be forced into a nuclear confrontation by sending ever more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, from which it would ultimately back down. Chalmers describes NATO's strategy over the last 3 months as that of, quote, boiling the Russian frog. You all remember the picture, where if you, according to the story, I don't think it's actually true, but according to the story, if you throw a frog into boiling water, the frog jumps out. But if you put the frog into the water pot when the water is cold, and then you slowly increase the temperature, the frog ends up being boiled and having not even noticed it. So he talks about boiling the Russian frog by progressively increasing the size and sophistication of the weapons supplied to Ukraine. Because of those weapons, Ukraine may be in a position to reverse Russia's recent territorial gains and retake Kherson and Mariupol. That, however, would not occasion a nuclear threat, nor would Ukraine using those weapons and territorial gains to destroy bridges, railheads, storage sites, and air bases inside Russia. But should Ukraine move to retake Crimea, strike the tempting target, in quote, of the Kerch Bridge, for example, now that could lead to a Crimea missile crisis, Chalmers argues. Quote, a specific threat to use nuclear weapons in relation to Crimea might be viewed by Putin as a way to restore some of his coercive power, even if he and the US doubted whether he would deliver on such a threat. If a red line were not accepted by Ukraine, Russia might then feel that it had to consider a series of further escalatory options, such as putting nuclear forces on higher alert. They are already on alert. Faced with the alternative of the likely loss of Crimea, Putin might believe that Ukraine, with US encouragement, would be likely to blink first. It would be a moment of extreme peril, with all the parties seeking to understand the intent of each other, even as they looked into the pursuit of their national interest. Quote, precisely because of the peril inherent in such a situation, a nuclear crisis of this sort could make it easier for leaders to make difficult compromises. Provided that the war has ended and the blockade of Odessa lifted, Ukraine's leaders might be willing to postpone the settlement of the Crimea question. For Putin, the failure of the invasion and the subsequent success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive would have been a massive humiliation. But he would at least be able to argue that the might of the Russian strategic arsenal had, at a moment of great national weakness, successfully deterred NATO's designs for the dismembering of Russia. This could be enough for both sides to avoid the worst outcome of all. I mean, this is complete insanity, you know, saying that one has to retake or threaten to retake Crimea and then get all the nuclear weapons on the highest alert, and then we can sit down and settle. So he calls that a Cuban Missile Crisis, the Crimea Cuban Missile Crisis on steroid. Now, that policy of boiling the Russian frog, that has not started 3 months ago, but that has been the method since 1990, when on February 9th, James Baker III promised that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward to Gorbachev. In the entire Yeltsin period, there was a policy to reduce the former superpower into a raw material exporting nation with the shock therapy of Jeffrey Sachs. And between 91 and 94, the industrial potential of Russia was reduced to only 30%. There is a very important book by Sergei Glaziev which describes the 90s with the title Genocide, because that is what was imposed on Russia at that time. Now, the crime of Putin is that he tried to reverse that and had some success with it. The answer was color revolutions, regime change, humanitarian wars, like the 20 years in Afghanistan, where as a result of the hasty retreat of NATO and the US in August, now there are 24 million people at starvation levels in Afghanistan, exposed to COVID, measles, polio, without adequate medicine. So if one would have equally detailed TV coverage of Afghanistan for 20 years, like we see it now about Ukraine every day, maybe the world would have been equally upset, or maybe not, because the Afghanis are not white. Then you had the Iraq War in 2003, about which Nancy Pelosi admitted publicly that all responsible people knew ahead of time that there were no weapons of mass destruction. You had Libya. Hillary Clinton, during the Durham investigation in the United States, had to admit that the entire basis of Russiagate were all lies. Did one see anything about that in the mainstream media? Absolutely not, at least not in Europe. Then there was Syria. Then you had the 2014 Maidan coup, about which Victoria Nuland bragged $5 billion were spent by the State Department on NGOs. And let's not forget the Azov battalion, which, people in the West are now, media in the West are saying there are no Nazis in Ukraine, but it is a documented fact that there are. Now, Putin, as a result of this boiling of the Russian frog over almost 30 years, on December 15th, demanded legally binding security guarantees from the United States and NATO. He has not received an answer from the US or NATO on the core demands, only on arms control, but that was not the essence of what he was demanding. The head of the Russian National Security Council, Patrushev, said that Russia had no other way because they were threatened in the existence of the statehood of Russia when they made what they call the limited military action in Ukraine. And, one can absolutely argue that Russia was in a situation, according to UN Charter Article 51, which is a question of self-defense and not of aggression. Now we are facing, with Finland and Sweden, the sixth expansion of NATO. That is the answer which Stoltenberg even brags about. He says Putin wanted less NATO, now he gets more NATO. So the boiling temperature is just being increased. One has to take this insane policy of causing a Crimea Cuban Missile Crisis together with another British policy which was exposed in a paper by the Henry Jackson Society in 2020, which they put again on the front page of the website of the Henry Jackson Society, which means it's ongoing policy of that think tank. It is a report outlining a strategy to use the infamous Five Eyes alliance, meaning the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, as the instrument to force through the economic decoupling of the West from China. This rabidly anti-Russia, anti-China neocon think tank is run by British intelligence through, among others, the former MI6 chief Sir Richard Dearlove, who is the main brain of Russiagate, which just was completely discredited as a lie. And he was one of the founders of the Henry Jackson Society and is one of its principals today. So even the attempt to decouple China from the international system before consummated could detonate an economic nuclear bomb upon the entire world economy. China is not just the world's largest trading power. It's currently generating the highest rate of scientific and technological development on the planet, a productive power which the developing nations, sector nations, and the collapsing Western nations urgently require if they want to survive. But actual nuclear warfare could there also be the result, because part of the Henry Jackson Society strategy is to build up ties with Taiwan, leading to its separation from China. China has made abundantly clear that it will respond with overwhelming military force to any attempt to split Taiwan off from the nation of China. This is as dangerous a proposition as a NATO-backed Ukraine moving to retake Crimea. So when President Biden made a gaffe in answer to a reporter on his recent trip to Japan. Would the United States defend Taiwan militarily? Biden said again, yes, and he had to be corrected again by the White House. Now, the Chinese already had editorials where they said, this is not a gaffe, this is a signal of what is the real intention of the United States. And Chess Freeman, who was the deputy defense secretary, and he was the official translator of President Nixon on his trip to China in '72, he warned and called it a colossal mistake for Biden of having made such a stupid statement. Now, President Biden is currently championing these precise British strategies on his current trip to China. Fresh from celebrating the expansion of NATO, Biden is to unveil a grandiose Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, EPEF, during his stop in Japan as the highlight of the trip. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan stated bluntly on Wednesday, May 18th, that the message of the IPEF is that, quote, democracies and open societies of the world stand together to shape the rules of the road. We think that message will be heard everywhere. We think it will be heard in Beijing. 52 US senators sent Biden off on his trip with instructions that Taiwan be incorporated as one of the countries participating in the IPEF, which is clearly not acceptable from the standpoint of China, because it is a violation of the One China policy. Now, just today, if you open the media, if you look at TV, newspapers, a huge scandal story about pictures from the supposed labor camps in Xinjiang were, in quote, investigated by a group of international media, that 1 million Uyghurs would be tortured, beaten in labor camps, forced labor, and so forth. Naturally, our so-called Foreign Minister Baerbock had immediately an outcry demanding a transparent clearing up of the accusations. Calls that all relations with China should be cut after cutting relations with Russia, and that, you know, basically all trade with China should be stopped. Now, let's look at it realistically. China in 2021 was the third largest partner for the EU export of goods, 10.2%, and the largest partner for the EU import of goods, 22.4%. For Germany, it was the largest trading partner for goods in 2021, with a volume of trade of over 245 million euro. To cut that would mean total economic suicide, which is already happening with the relation with Russia. Now, what is the source of this incredible story? Now, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, one of the leading newspapers in Germany, says all the photos and data have been made available to Adrian Zenz, a German anthropologist and longtime Xinjiang observer. Now, this Mr. Adrian Zenz claims that he got all of that from an unnamed source, who had access to, cyber spying and whatnot. Well, that's a very dubious observation. Now, Adrian Zenz is not an unknown entity. The blog, The Grey Zone, and the very respected investigative journalist Ajit Singh and Max Blumeshol already wrote in articles in 2019, after he had come up with a similar story about genocide in Xinjiang, that Mr. Zenz is a right-wing Christian fundamentalist who opposes homosexuality and gender equality. He is in favor of scriptural spanking of children, and he claims that he is led by God on a mission against China, because the end times are near and the rise of the Antichrist is also coming. He is on a complete rampage, saying that the genocide in Xinjiang is because of a collapse of the demographic curve of the Uyghurs, and the Lyle Goldstein, who is a professor at the Naval War College in the United States, says such a statement is ridiculous to the point of being insulting to those who lost relatives in the Holocaust. There is ample evidence that there is no demographic collapse of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, just the opposite. There is a 2019 study in the British medical journal Lancet, which talks about a massive improvement of life expectancy among the Uyghurs, a demographic growth rate which is much higher than that of the Han Chinese, an improvement of the maternal health, an infant mortality, and all of this represents a remarkable success story. Sen's so-called testimony comes from Uyghur exiles who are cultivated by the US State Department. Sen's served as a fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C., which is a right-wing lobbying group born out of the National Captive Nations Committee. Now that is a very, very interesting connection, because that was founded by the Ukrainian nationalist Lev Dobryansky, who is basically heading this institution, of which the co-chairman was Jaroslav Stetsko, who was one of the leaders of the OUN-B militia, which is the Nazi group that fought along the German Nazis during the occupation of Ukraine in World War II. Stetsko and his wife had a residence in Munich for the entire post-war period and led from there the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. After he died, Mrs. Stetsko went to Ukraine and rebuilt the OUN, the Bandera organization, in the tradition of the ideas of Stepan Bandera. Now, that is a direct connection to that apparatus, which was heavily led by the Western secret services. Bandera himself joined the MI6 in 1947. And, you know, the BND in Munich had a close, at least, knowledge about these people, to say the least. Sen's was also deployed by the Jamestown Foundation, a neocon think tank in DC, which was founded by CIA Director William Casey as an extra-governmental channel to pay Soviet dissidents. If Germany or other European nations fall for this intelligence operation, which is exactly what the Henry Jackson Society talked about, namely the 5 eyes at work, if they follow this, it would be complete economic suicide. Now, even Henry Kissinger, at the age of 99 years, is more reasonable. In Davos, he just said that the world has maximum a window of 2 months to end the Ukraine war through negotiations. And he appealed to the Ukraine that they should agree to a territorial compromise to get peace. At the Schiller conference on April 9th, we presented a completely different approach. There is an alternative to the complete decoupling between the so-called democracies and the global south on the other side. The new system is already emerging rapidly. There are many countries who at the recent foreign minister meeting of the BRICS want to be part of it. Argentina, Indonesia, Egypt, Nigeria, many others. You have the BRICS enlarged, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, almost all organizations of the global south who want to be part of a new international security and development architecture, which basically is the combination of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative together with two other proposals by President Xi Jinping, the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, which is actively being implemented. Now, what we need is such a conference for a new international security and development architecture in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. Now, the Peace of Westphalia was the recognition of all war parties that if they would continue the war, nobody would be left to enjoy the victory because they all would be dead. And that is why they developed the principle that any peace must be based on the interest of the other, the security interest of every country on the planet, which today would mean a security architecture emphatically involving Russia and China. And such a conference must address the causes for the war danger, because it is not enough at this point to be against the war. You have to solve the problem that the collapse of the neoliberal financial system is in progress. Lyndon LaRouche has a unique record that he foresaw what is happening today, the present crisis, already in August 1971, when Nixon ended the old Bretton Woods system by replacing the fixed exchange rate system with a floating exchange rate system. And LaRouche at that time predicted that if you would continue on that road, it would lead to a new depression, the danger of a new war, and fascism. And that is exactly where we are today. LaRouche proposed 4 laws to solve the crisis. The first step, a global Glass-Steagall banking separation system, must end the casino economy. There must be capital and exchange controls to prevent the speculative manipulation of currencies, which we see right now in much of the world. Every country must have a national bank to make credit generation, again, the question of the sovereign government and not that of private bankers, in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. Then these national banks must be connected through a credit system which provides long-term, low-interest credit for real investment in the physical economy. Also, the 4th law is that we must have a crash program for fusion technology, which in the recent period has made tremendous progress, and the commercial use of it is on the horizon visible. Because we need a massive increase in the productivity of the world economy, because just the fact that 1.7 billion people are threatened with starvation, that 2 billion have no clean water, is the proof that the present level of productivity has fallen way below the level of maintaining the present world population of 8 billion people. And there must be international cooperation, not only for fusion technology, but also for space technology and space travel, because that is the avant-garde of the scientific and technological realm today. So we are right now confronted with a situation where the leading governments and institutions are challenged. Are we able to solve the problems of the world? Are we able to address the problems, which are threatening the very existence of mankind, or not? Now, the Schiller Institute has proposed for more than 30 years the Eurasian land bridge first, the new Silk Road, and in 2014 we proposed the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge. Please show the slide. Now, this is a blueprint how we can overcome world poverty, how we can eradicate underdevelopment forever, and how can we create a new world health system for a modern health system for every country in the world, which is the only way how we can overcome old and new diseases, this pandemic, and threatening new pandemics. Now, this is absolutely possible. And, this is the vision how the world will look in a few years anyway, if we avoid the present danger of nuclear war. The development of infrastructure connecting all continents is the natural way how infrastructure development will continue, provided there is peace. So I think that is something we need to put on the agenda for discussion. And the reason why, despite the incredible danger, one can be optimistic is because we are the human species. We are capable of reason, and we are not barbarians. Thank you.
Okay, we have 10 minutes now for questions to Helga. If you want to ask a question yourself, please use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to write your question, use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't want your name to be announced, then just write no name. So, are there any questions? Elena? Okay, while we're waiting for Elena, we have a question from Jørgen Nielsen, one of our speakers. You have to unmute, Jørgen.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first, thank you for a very good presentation. I totally agree with you. I have one question, because as you may know, I live in Denmark. Copenhagen will have a referendum in a week's time about the European Union. And talks about, so we are discussing in our country for the time being, the role of European Union and what should we have an army? How should we secure security? I would like a few words. How do you think about European Union in this context? Because I am somehow skeptical, I can say, but I would like to hear your opinion on European Union and development right now of European Union in this context.
And also specifically the question of the European military arm, yes, which is the subject of the referendum.
Yes, of course, and the policy toward Ukraine and Russia.
Well, I think that when there was a referendum about the EU constitution in France and Holland in '95, which was lost because the majority voted against it. And then they shifted it to the Lisbon Treaty, because by not calling it a constitution, but by calling it a treaty, it did not require a vote. So this was made in great secrecy. We were extremely closely watching it at that time. And, if you look at the charter of the EU as it was agreed upon in Lisbon, it is practically interwoven with NATO in such a degree that the Article 5 of NATO practically also involves the EU. With other words, when you join the EU, you are practically also, part of whatever NATO does. And I think the character of NATO has really dramatically changed in the last 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the time of the Soviet Union, it was a defensive apparatus against the Warsaw Pact. But in the recent period, it has turned into a complete anti-Russian, Russophobe alliance. And therefore, when in 2013, in November, the Ukraine government under Yanukovych refused to join the EU association agreement, it was clear that, if Ukraine would join the EU, it practically would give NATO access to the Black Sea. And that is why he opted out in the last moment. So I think that is an important thing to keep in mind. And the fact that Ursula von der Leyen is on the forefront of all the policies which I described as British in my various examples, you know, the fight between the so-called democracies and so-called autocratic regimes. I mean, she is talking about that like every day. She went to India talking like that. So I think that the present EU has completely lost touch with the interest of its member states. I think they have become a gigantic waterhead of a bureaucracy in Brussels who makes, for the most part, completely ridiculous decisions and orders and rules which are in the absolute contrary to the interest of the member countries. And I actually have called that Germany should move out of the EU, because we don't need a bureaucracy to have a unified Europe. We could have a Europe of the fatherlands in the spirit of Charles de Gaulle. We could work together for a joint mission, you know, to help, you know, contribute to shape a new world order in a positive way. We could do that by having, you know, national sovereign governments just work together. You don't need this bureaucracy. So that is my view, and I would just advise, you know, anybody who has an interest in their own sovereignty to not join this colossus.
Excuse me, Elena, you can ask your question now.
But can you hear me? Because
yes. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I find everything that Madame Helga said very, very interesting. And of course, at the moment, as I am very interested in the situation between Ukraine and Russia, my optimistic feeling is that Russia is going to come to how to say, to a solution with Ukraine, because as I have heard today, Putin has been somehow winning on the territories. So most likely something good will happen. However, I think that what Madame said, it's so beautiful that I would like to have something to read if possible, because at first my computer was, the connection was not very good and I was not listening. It went up and down, you know, it wasn't, I wasn't able. So then I changed the room. I came near the modem and I was able to listen better. However, I would be very grateful if Madame can make me have what she said in a written sheet, something written that I can read and study, because so that I can write an article about what she has said, what are the goals of this new architecture, and make other people know about it. Because I had sent a letter to the rector of the university in Taranto, but he is not here anymore. I didn't know that. So a friend told me that he was in Rome, and I tried to write a letter to him to explain that there was new solutions to the problems about the world security. And I was asking him if he could give me some the names of some professors in the university here in my town, in Taranto, that I can contact, so that I can tell them if they want to cooperate. And if some...
excuse me, we're running short of time, but we will have a transcript of Helga's comments that we will send to you and all of the participants, and also the video of this conference will be available to send around. So just one more questioner, Kwame, if you have a short question. go ahead.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. That's my present name, Kwame Ingemar, and then family name Ljungqvist. I'm a Swede. And thank you for a nice presentation. And my question, because I don't know, may you say that China is united and in full control of the Chinese Communist Party? Or are there some Chinese oligarchs that has good connection with the American counterpart? As for, you know, they sent some money into the Wuhan laboratory, maybe to somehow get them connected to the globalists in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, my question is, have they got full control, the Chinese Communist Party, over the situation in the country?
Yes, I would say absolutely yes. And, you know, I just should say something, because right now when you say communist, some people fall completely in you know, coma and have hysterical outbursts. I mean, the Communist Party of China is, in my view, and I don't even think that they would agree with it, but I think they are 90% Confucian in the tradition of the ancient Chinese traditions and philosophy, which, you know, influenced China policy for more than 2 millennia. And naturally, there is an element of Marxism and communism, but it's a meritocracy. You know, the way people look at the CPC in the West is completely uninformed. And I can only, I mean, my best way of answering is that I was in China the first time in 1971, in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, and I could travel around in Shanghai, Tianjin, Tsingtao, Beijing. I could visit the countryside, and I saw a country which was really distraught. People were poor, the conditions were very terrible. The beautiful garden of the Summer Palace was painted all with red color by the Revolutionary Guards. In any case, this was 51 years ago. And, you know, when you go to China now, I mean, it is so developed. They have 40,000 kilometers of fast train system, of which nobody in Europe or the United States can even dream, because we have nothing like that. China has made an incredible development. 850 million people have been lifted out of poverty. And I could say many, many more things. So the question is, you know, Deng Xiaoping coined the word judging truth from facts. And if you look at the facts of the gigantic development of China in the last 40 years in particular, you know, then this Communist Party has done something right. And, you know, if you travel to China and study Chinese history and meet people in all ranks of life, you know, professors, students, people living in the countryside, other professions, you go to restaurants, you know, you see how people live. You find a population which is primarily content. They're optimistic. They're not like the Europeans, and for sure not like the Germans, who are completely pessimistic and, you know, think nothing can function and you can't do anything anyway. No, that is not the view. They are optimistic. They have, to a very large extent, trust in the government. And I think that, you know, the Chinese model, which the West is now regarding as a big competitor and threat, the Chinese model is doing something right, which the West is not doing right. And rather than opposing it, we should go to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and say we should respect each other, even if the other one has a different social system, and even if the other one has a different way of doing things according to their history, their tradition. And I think then we can absolutely peacefully live together. And that is my stated view. And I think all the slanders about China are really absolutely unfounded. And, you know, in particular, this present campaign by this very dubious Andrian sense, we should squash before it really takes hold.
All right, thank you very much, Helga. I really appreciate your very in-depth discussion. Now we will hear from Jørgen Nielsen, who has degrees in the history of ideas and communication. He was a Moscow correspondent for the major Danish daily Politiken in the late 1990s. He's the author of several books about Russia and Ukraine, a leader of the Russian-Danish Dialogue organization, and an associate professor of communication and cultural differences at the Niels Brock Business College in Denmark. The word is yours.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Do I have 20 minutes, Michelle?
Yes.
20 minutes, okay, fine. And thank you very much for the invitation. I think this conference is both very timely and it's very relevant, because I have lived for many years. You can look at the color of my hair. You can be sure that I have lived for several decades. And I don't remember during all these years after the Second World War, we are in a situation like we are in now. Because I remember I was a small boy during the Cuba Missile Crisis in 1962. I didn't know very much about it, but I remember my parents and all adults were very nervous about it. But still, I would say now I sometimes look back at this time for the old Cold War. I think we're much better at this time. And I never thought I should come to this point. Sometimes I wake up in the morning, I hope everything is a nightmare, but I'm afraid it is not. I'm afraid I'm alive, I'm not sleeping, I'm not dreaming. It is reality right now. And because if you look I'll just say about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy, well, they found common language, like they say in Russian, общий язык, and they got along and they found a solution pretty quickly. They somehow respected each other. The thing, if you look at how Nixon and Brezhnev, their relationship was, of course, they were opponents, of course, competitors. Yes, of course they were, but they had some respect of each other. The same goes for Reagan and Gorbachev, and so on and so on. So that's what I think that the time right now is awful, because we don't have this respect. If you look at how they describe Putin in the media, and had been doing so for, I would say, 15, maybe almost 20 years, it's like defamation, denigration, hatred, open hatred, scorn, and such kind of things. And I think it's a very bad omen. It's a very bad sign that we're in from very troublesome times. I would like to talk a little about two questions which very seldom are being asked and very seldom being answered. Those are the two questions. The first question, which I will talk a little about more in length, it's how did we end up there? How did it come that now we have 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we ended up in this situation where we are actually closer than ever to the annihilation of the human race? I think it's a very, very basic question. Of course, the second question, what do we do? How do we get out of this? How do we get to the negotiation table to negotiate peace terms? Things like that. And maybe a third question, of course, how do we build a new world? It's on it's not right now, because right now it's about how do we prevent a nuclear war. But these two questions, I will handle a little. How did we get there? And I think Jan Erber next he'll talk a little about more what we should do, or maybe even more what we should not do. I can say so. I've been around for all these 30 years. Actually, I was working in Russia also. This time I worked on some embassies in the former Soviet republics and started to learn Russian language, even a little before that. And secondly, I was married to a Russian 30 years back in '92. And we had hopes for a new world. We had hopes that that, you know, we just left the Cold War and we had hopes that we should live in a peaceful world. And here we are, 30 years after, but there's some hope. We are not divorced and we are not planning to do so. So there's a little hope there, I would say. Well, back to what has happened, because in 1991, when Soviet Union was dissolved and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, I traveled a lot in Russia. I was very much in Russia. I had Russian friends, and they were all enthusiastic. They were all optimistic. Now we're entering a new world. Now we have a new harmonious world marked by harmony and peace and development and things like that. They emphatically wanted to be part of the West. They wanted to share our values and things like that. So if you had this picture in the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, it was very difficult to live in Russia because everything broke down and there was chaos, but they wanted to be part of the West. So the good question is, what actually happened? Why didn't it turn out this way? And there are several stepstones in this, I would say, because already in the beginning of the 90s, Bill Clinton, I would say when Bill Clinton came to power in United States in the beginning of the 90s, he first endorsed a plan of the Eastern European countries becoming part of NATO, leaving Russia outside. And thus, in this way, I would say he declined the proposal of Mr. Gorbachev to build a European house. There was actually built a European house, but it was a European house based on military and with Russia being outside. A European house, Russia being outside. And at this time in United Nations, even in Europe, many people warned, said that it would not work. It would definitely not work because even the liberals in Russia, and many of those very pro-Western liberals said it's a very bad idea. But it worked this way because Clinton was very, he was very insisting on this, and it started at this time. And then they had, I don't know if it was bad luck, maybe intentionally, that they adopted Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic at the same time as it started to bomb in Serbia. And Serbia is a very close ally historical ally for Russia. So at this time, I was a journalist at this time. I talked to a lot of people. I talked to Sakharov's widow, Yelena Bonner. I talked to all the liberals. I talked to whom not I talked to at this time. And everyone was very sharply opposed to this. At this time, I think if you should put a year, it was 1999. A year, you know, for when the split actually began. Maybe it started a little earlier, but at this time it was obvious. And then Putin came, you know, he came in this situation. He didn't create this situation. Many people think that the Russians were liberals and then the evil Putin came along. No, it's the other way around. Actually, Putin took the agenda of the Russian people, and even not that, because funny enough, Putin was very eager to join NATO. It's very interesting to talk about this today. He wanted Russia to join NATO. At least he said so in an interview at BBC in 2000, when he just became president. But things, even in Afghanistan, Putin supported the West. He helped the West in Afghanistan. He did everything to become friend. He made a speech in the Bundestag, in the parliament in Berlin, and he did everything he could, but he found out in vain, because Russia was doomed to be left out of this new security architecture, because European security was NATO without Russia. And I think everything started to deteriorate from this. You could make some stepstones. I'll just mention a very few. You can say that in 2008, there was a NATO summit in Bucharest in Romania. And at this point, George W. Bush was the president at this time. He invited Georgia and Ukraine to NATO, become part of NATO. Well, there was France and Germany was not that enthusiastic about this, so they actually turned it down. But it was kept on the agenda that they had, that these two countries had an invitation. And Putin was present at this conference, and he was very, very angry and opposed it, but nothing happened really. And you can say, as the solution at the NATO summit was the worst conceivable resolution, because first they made the Ukrainians and Georgians think that they would have the backing of NATO if they attack Russia, or like Saakashvili in Georgia did in 2008. And secondly, it raised the suspicion of the Russians, and it didn't solve anything. So from that, it became even worse. In Ukraine, you even at this time, you had a very Russophobe, very anti-Russian government. Because in Ukraine, you have approximately 50% Russian speakers wanted to not to join Russia, but to have friendly relation to Russia and at least be neutral as a state. Many of the western parts of Ukraine, many people that will think otherwise, they would think that they should join NATO and European Union. So it's a divided country in many ways. But at least at this point in 2008, when Ukraine was invited, interesting enough, 17% of the Ukrainian population wanted to join NATO. I think it was 66%, two-thirds of the population did not want to join NATO. I think it's very interesting figures, because it says everything that America had an agenda to pull Ukraine out of the Russian orbit, and they didn't even hide it. Speaking of Brzezinski, he wrote, he was a security advisor, he even wrote a book about the Grand Chessboard, where he openly wrote, yes, we want to tear Ukraine out of the orbit of this Russian zone. So how much stability could you build there? And things went even worse. And interesting enough, in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych and from the party of Regents, he was elected president. And in 2012, his party and some other parties had the majority. And they were in favor of Ukraine continuing to be a neutral country. And secondly, they were in favor of close cooperation with Russia in terms of gas deliverance and in terms of the rent of the naval base of Sevastopol and in Crimea, and so on and so on. And then you had a discussion, Helga already mentioned it about the association agreement with the European Union. And Yanukovych, he read it very carefully and found out that it was not very benevolent for Ukraine, and he declined to sign it. Then came the Maidan and all this kind of things. And in February 2014, there was actually what I will call a coup. You can't, in my opinion, you cannot call it anything but a coup. It was not a regular, it was not in the parliament, there was not enough votes in the parliament, and it was a military coup, nothing short of it, I would say. And then came destruction of Ukraine, then, because in the eastern part, they had voted in towns like Lugansk, almost 90% had voted for the Party of Regions. In Donetsk, it was 85 something. Crimea, the same, 85% had voted for this party they have just kicked out of the government. So of course they reacted to this, and Crimea, they was a secession from Ukraine, and they eventually became a part of Russia, and well, so what? Then started, the war. The Ukrainian army then started to attack the republicans who has declared themselves independent, because you can say from a legal point of view, if you can make a coup in Kiev, you can also make a coup in Donetsk. You can do whatever. And at least in Donetsk and Lugansk, they had some referendum. They elected new bodies, governmental bodies, in these two republics. So, but at least there, the sanctions regime started, and even much more deterioration between NATO and Russia, much more. And so at this time, there was actually a real war going on in Donbass, in the eastern part of Donbass, which is industrial region of Ukraine. And many people in Denmark, when I discuss these matters with my fellow Danes, and I say, maybe you know that 14,000 people have been killed in this war. What? No, it's Russian propaganda. Well, it's definitely not, because this assessment of OSCE, this European Security Organization, which is, I think, is probably the only source we have for these kinds of figures. And at least some thousands of this 14,000 are civilian people, among those many children. But Russians can also see we don't cry for these children. We don't raise Russian flags for these children in our countries in the West. So many Russians tend to think, okay, then if we wanted to secure the security of Russian speakers, it should be Russia, because European Union are not at all interested. Ukrainian government is certainly not interested in protecting human rights for those people who wanted to keep their language or have some normal relations to Russia. So this is something which is going on in Russia, and also in at least part of the divided country, Ukraine. In 2015, there's a in February, there's a very interesting conference in Minsk, and Lukashenko was the host there. And it was an agreement between France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine, and also from those two republics. And it was signed an agreement according to which Ukraine was supposed to have direct negotiations with the leaders of those two republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. And the idea was that Ukraine was supposed to amend its constitution, so to allow for autonomous entities in Ukraine. So the thought being that Donetsk and Luhansk would be autonomous entities in Ukraine, deciding about which languages should be, deciding also about having veto in questions about military policy and things like that. And I think it was actually the best you could achieve. And I think at this point I would commend Merkel, because Merkel, she made this agreement without the immediate support of USA. She did it on herself. She brought Hollande from France with her and made this agreement, which is the best you could achieve at the time. But very soon it became clear that the president Petro Poroshenko, he was not master in his own house, as we say, because he wanted to get it through in the parliament. What happened? Some of these right-wing groups, Helga also talked about, they exploded people at the parliament. At the entrance of the parliament, 3 people were killed at this point, and they threatened Poroshenko, say if he would go on and realize these provisions in a Minsk II agreement, he would be killed in a basement. He didn't want to be killed in a basement, so he stopped it. And later on, Zelensky, the same goes for him. Zelensky he also wanted to. He said in his when he ran for president that he wanted to make peace. He wanted also to fulfill the agreements of Minsk II. And what happened? He was threatened also, and nothing happened. And they actually, both Poroshenko and later Zelensky, said that we will not fulfill this agreement. So it's a clear speech, you would say. But at this point, Germany and France didn't say anything. You could have imagined that they would have told the Ukrainian government, please, you know what, you signed an agreement, and we expect that you fulfill the provisions of the agreement. So much more than this Minsk II became part of United Nations policy. The Security Council actually adopted it as official UN policy. But Ukrainian government didn't care about it. And no Western country would ever mention that they should fulfill this agreement. Now I can see I'm running a little out of time. I'll just say, if you go a little further, Zelensky came to power. 70% of the Ukrainian population supported him. Why? Because he said that he was in for peace. He would like to have an agreement with Russia. He will solve the problems with negotiations in Donbass, as Luhansk and Donetsk. But he was threatened also, and he went back from this policy. Instead, he invited even more from 2017-18. It was actually during the reign of Donald Trump. Ukraine was armed more and more and more, and they started to have common military exercises. They installed several what kind of military technique in the eastern part, also in Ukraine. So you could say that even though Ukraine was not part of NATO, NATO was in Ukraine, of course. If you go even further, I would like to say last year, 2021, there was several interesting things. 1 year ago, even more, it's in March last year, Zelensky claimed that he actually declared war. He said he would like to take Crimea and Donbass with military and supported by NATO. Not like NATO soldiers, but NATO equipment, NATO training, and things like that. And in 2021, there was a naval exercise in the Black Sea with 32 countries participating in this, 32 countries. And further on, you could say that in February 2022, in February the 16th, if you look at what the OSCE, their assessment of what happened, when they count how many explosions, how many shootings, how many killings, how many this and that, it's their job to do this. They said that from February the 16th, there was an increase of almost 30 times more explosions. And what does that mean? It does mean actually that the Ukrainian army at this point already had started a war. 110,000 Ukrainian soldiers were ready in Donbass and ready to enter Donbass. And also they had claimed, as I said, they would like to take Crimea. So now we go to February 24th. Putin had to deal with a situation. I'm not endorsing Putin's decision. I'm not sure it's right. I'm not saying it's right. But he had a very, very difficult situation. So this situation did not just come out of the blue, out of nothing. Of course, there's a context. There's a history before that. And if we would like to solve the problem, we should find ways to find peaceful solutions. I think we should start here. We should start with why did we end up here? And it also wise somehow to look into why did we end up here? Maybe we made some mistakes. Maybe we did some here in our part of the world. Maybe we did something actually which could make Putin think that we had evil intentions. Because very often we say NATO is a defensive organization. We couldn't dream of attacking anything. But if you look at what is happening in Ukraine, the last year, from let's at least say from March 21 to February 22, this year, if you look at what happened there, you couldn't. If you sit in Russia and watch what's happening there, it's very, very obvious that there's intention of taking this back, and this is a red line for Russia. They said so, and there's no doubt that Russia has a red line, and somehow you have to act to it. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but to say that Putin is a madman, that he's lost, he just became crazy or something, it's not. I think it's not relevant. I'm not saying he made the right decision, but he is not a madman. He has some. He looks at the world from another angle. Actually, I think my 20 minutes has passed now, hasn't it, Michelle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very, very much, Jens-Jørgen. Next, we will have Jan Erber, who is a peace and future researcher and art photographer. He has a PhD in sociology. He's been a visiting professor in peace and conflict studies in Japan, Spain, Austria, and Switzerland. And he is co-founder and director of the independent Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Lund, Sweden, as well as being an author.
Okay, I will start again and say thank you very much for the invitation to this highly important, urgently needed discussion, dialogue, which we certainly also need at some point to have with people outside the West. But let me just say that I have the following points to try to do. A little bit of the background where we are, not necessarily what led us to be here, because Jens-Jørgen has done that so excellently, but I have another perspective on it, which has to do with the decline and coming fall of the US empire, which challenges us all worldwide much more than anything else, because we don't know how peaceful or non-peaceful it will be. Secondly, I would say a little bit about, which you've asked me to do, a little bit in that perspective of Sweden and Finland joining or having applied to join NATO, which is a huge change in all, from all perspectives. Sweden having been a non-aligned, not neutral, but non-aligned country for more than 200 years, and changing this within, a few weeks in panic. And third, then, which is my main task, the two others were kind of short ones. The main task is to discuss how could we make a more secure world. And you have used the word architecture, and that part will take the points of departure in Gorbachev's idea. Architecture has to do with houses and buildings, and he talked about a European house. So from there, I would take the last 30 years, what should we have done, and what could we very easily have done if we had another leadership in NATO and the Western world, and another way of dealing with the demise of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. But first of all, let me say a little bit about the background. I, for one, advocated 30 years ago that since the raison d'etre of NATO was the existence of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, with those two gone, NATO did not have a raison d'etre anymore. It was pretty obvious to me. I interviewed people in NATO when I wrote my doctoral dissertation. It was quite obvious to me that there was no way you could argue for anything else, because the argument was NATO existed because the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union existed. Parenthesis, we all know that NATO was created before in 49 and the Warsaw Pact in 55. But at least, even from a realpolitik point of view, that would have been the moment to discuss what should be post-NATO. Post-NATO in the sense that NATO had done what it should do. And the second thing I think is very important to say is we're dealing here with something which I would say, yes, Russia is responsible for the war, but under all wars and violence is a conflict. And NATO is responsible for that conflict because of not having dissolved itself, but even and not kept the same, but against all promises given to Gorbachev to expand it into now 12 new members, which means that the whole thing from northern Norway, Finland down to Turkey is now closed in, so to speak. And that is an asymmetric conflict for all these years, where, the last 30 years, Russia has been a power with about 8% of the military expenditures of the NATO alliance, of the Western alliance. So if you go back to the first Cold War period, the Warsaw Pact was something like 65 to 75, going up and down a little bit, of NATO. So we have an asymmetric conflict, no matter how you define it, an asymmetric conflict. Russia is not a superpower globally in terms of culture, economy, political clout, and all that, and militarily, etc. There's only one superpower, and that's the United States, and there's only one super alliance, and that's NATO. So the thing I see now is that we've come to the point where this NATO expansion, we're obviously going too far. You have everybody who knows anything about realpolitik, Mearsheimer, Kissinger, Brzezinski, etc. Even I myself, who is not a realpolitician analyst, warned against the idea of trying ever to get Ukraine into NATO. And nobody listened. NATO is an autistic alliance. Nobody listened. Nobody listened to Putin, as we've just heard. Nobody listened to other warnings. Nobody listened to George Kennan, who shortly before he died said, for God's sake, don't do it. Because these people live in a kind of echo chamber and group think. We are so great, we have a right on our side and we can do whatever we will, even not thinking a word of how we are perceived by the other side. And I think that's a characteristic at the moment. NATO does not see itself as part of a conflict. And a conflict takes two parties. NATO is basically, and our media are basically seeing that there is one good guy, and that's called NATO. And it has a house, and it has expanded its house and all that. But then it has somebody out there in the street who's all the time trying to steal, get into, is a threat to, could do bad things to us, etc. So it seemed like we are the good guys, and out there's a criminal called Russia and Putin. But we are not in a conflict, because a conflict means that it's an exchange of actions, one action and then a reaction, and then a reaction to the reaction, etc. So by that, you free yourself of any kind of responsibility for the present situation. Now, that is fundamentally new. There was nobody who would have discussed in the first Cold War years that there was a conflict between two blocs who had an interchange, and where you had the OSCE and others to do confidence-building measures, and you had neutral countries, buffer zones, and all that. So what are we seeing today? We are not seeing a Western attempt to help Ukraine. We are seeing an attempt to use Ukraine as the battlefield for fighting Russia militarily, until, as Secretary of Defense Austin in the US said, until it is sufficiently weakened militarily so it will not be able to do anything like this again and will not get back to the level at which it was. That's what you use Ukraine for now. You pump in officially $40–50 billion of weapons. Mind you, Russia's total annual budget is 66. You rearm Germany allegedly with 100 billion new dollars, which is almost twice of the Russian military budget. So in the future, you will have something like, Russia being 2% of NATO or something like that in military expenditure terms. And then you have history's strongest, unlimited, unconditioned sanctions, which means try to undermine the Russian economy. What's the long-term purpose? I think it will not succeed. I think the West will have huge boomerang effects from this, and social turmoil and economic crisis and all the things we have already heard. But what will be the idea is cancel Russia, build a new wall, have nothing to do with it, take Dostoevsky out of the libraries, no exchange, no visits, no university cooperation, cut it off completely, and make sure that Russia is no more, can be perceived as a threat. Now that's the problem for NATO. NATO cannot live without threats, without image of threats, without insisting that somebody is an enemy. So what will come after that when we've kind of finished, and that's where I'm equally afraid of nuclear war. When we've finished Russia, the West can concentrate on China. You see, this is what Ukraine is about, in my view. It's not a very nice view, but I have a nasty mind. And if you don't have a nasty mind, you will not understand security politics and war preparation and power politics. So this is where we are. NATO is anything but a defensive alliance. Because if you have offensive weapons, such as nuclear weapons, such as long-range weapons, which all the big powers, China, Russia, France, Britain, US, etc., have, then you are not a defensive alliance. You can say that you have no offensive intentions, but if you can kill people 5,000 kilometers away, you are not seen as defensive, technically, militarily, in the eyes of the other. So this has always been nonsense, propaganda, and of course that's why every mainstream newspaper today, media will tell you, always put the word defense in front, the defensive alliance NATO. And that, of course, is because it has nothing to do with the reality. I'll come back to the difference between defensive and offensive in that moment. Now, so that means unless somebody stops to think, we're heading for the idea of a partial destruction of Russia out of Europe. And I think no matter how much I disagree and distance myself from the Russian invasion in Ukraine, there is no defense in that perspective for what NATO is planning now, is clearly saying, for those who care to listen to others than mainstream media, and that all this incredible human citizens' hate of Russia must come from somewhere. Most people who hate Russia have never been to Russia and have no Russian friends. Most people who are very skeptical or critical or negative to China have never been to China. You can go on like that. These images of who we should hate and who we should love are constructed by the media, because the media go between us sitting somewhere and the reality for those who cannot go to these places and see for themselves, such as I have been able to do. And, you know, I've never been to a place anywhere in the world in which it looked like the media image. No conflict, no warfare, no war zone or anywhere else I've been. So let me put this into the perspective of Finland and Sweden. Finland and Sweden, particularly Sweden, which I know best since I live here, has for the last 20 years, 30 years, changed everything that was associated with Swedish neutrality and non-alignment and all of parliament, common security, disarmament, and a strong UN, and giving troops to the UN, etc. Anything, for those who are international listeners here, whatever Sweden used to be has nothing to do with it anymore. It has destroyed its own unique security political identity. And so it has cooperated all the time politically and in terms of military industry and in terms of strategic infrastructure planning with the US and NATO, huge exercises in Norrland, in the northern part of Sweden, a host nation support agreements so that the Americans could come in a crisis even before the NATO membership, and you can go on like that. So there's nothing surprising in that sense. What does surprise me is that Sweden joins without a real public discussion. Sweden joins without a referendum, with 48% of the people, according to opinion polls, in favor of NATO membership and 25% no, and the rest not decided. I would say 75% pro-NATO membership would be a minimum for such a huge, fundamentally and binding change for a country's foreign and security and defense policy. So you box that through in no time. And then the question is, who pushed you to do that? Well, I have an nasty mind again. I think that somebody has planned this. Use the Ukraine as a pretext for getting Sweden and Finland into NATO as fast as possible, and don't ask the people. It's a little bit different in Finland because according to opinion polls there was 76% of the people who were for it. But you can also ask yourself, how was that created? So again, the role of the media are important. Is very important in the sense that there has been only basically in the mainstream media pro-NATO articles, pro-NATO experts, pro-NATO military views, and fearology, the idea of using people's fears of something happening. I mean, Putin is going to occupy Gotland and Sweden in no time, or the Danish island south of Sweden called Bornholm. It will happen very quickly. This is to use people who are not experts, and most people are not, in security politics, to make them accept the most horrible policies, whether it's terror, or it's a COVID, or it is this. It's all built on fearology. So these were my first 2 points, the background and Sweden, Finland. I am deeply concerned about the latter because it'll take just a matter of time before there will be a request to have American bases in the two countries, like there will be in Denmark and Norway. And what Putin has said is he does not care too much about formal membership, but if you set up the infrastructure for warfare against my country, then I'm going to react. So we're all reducing the security of the Norwegians, the Danes, the Swedes, and the Finns very systematically. And our leaders and the elites who make these decisions are more loyal with Washington and Brussels than they are with their own people. There are words for that. So I agree it's not easy to talk about alternatives in this situation. I agree with those who said this is the most dangerous crisis since 1945, and I include the Cuban Missile Crisis there. And one reason I should add is there has been a huge intellectual disarmament. You can say any stupid thing and get away with it as a minister today, not having ever read a book about conflict, deterrence, peace, or anything else. We have always had a lot of weapons, too many in my view, but we've had responsible politicians who knew what they were doing. I'm not sure the present politicians in NATO countries know what they do. If there was something, you know, it was because both Kennedy and Khrushchev were intellectuals and had contact with each other and knew each other well. Today, there's no communication and there's no knowledge. You can get away with saying things which are banal, and you don't even have journalists who can ask questions like, where do you know that from? Or why do you see it that way? So the alternative I would see is abolish NATO. I'm not saying that's going to be the first thing they do. They probably instead, we should think of in terms of establishing an alternative system which would make NATO redundant. Now I'm into imagination and ideas, but if we don't have that, we're not going to succeed or survive. There must be good ideas somewhere, and it's not within the framework of militarism. So if you start out with a clean slate in Europe, what would a European secure house look like? First of all, it would be based on a couple of concepts. One being common security. We cannot feel secure if the other party does not feel secure with us. It's banal, but we are living in a world in which the banal things have to be said. Secondly, not national military security, but human security and global security. Third, giving priorities to conflict resolution and civilian means, and only resort to military as the last option, according as it is with the UN Charter. If we could just implement the UN Charter's way of thinking, which is the most Gandhian document humanity has, and the most intelligent, particularly Article 1, which says peace should be established by peaceful means. It's very simple. We just have to turn everything NATO does, if you will, on its head. For those who think we should have military defense, we should have defensive defense. Defensive weapons are weapons which have short range and limited destructive capacity, and therefore can be used in self-defense on each country's territory, as long as we have countries or nation states. Anything else will always mean that others will see you as a threat. So the defensive military system is one which only works when somebody comes to your territory, if you will, or you encroach upon your politics or whatever it is. In a wider sense, I'm not talking just about, you know, physical invasion. But everybody who says we are peaceful, but we can kill you guys 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers away have no idea what defensiveness is. Of course, it means nuclear weapons must go, because nobody wants to have nuclear weapons used on their own territory. That's quite sensible, I would say. They are only meant for others. So you have defensiveness in the military, and you can discuss, you know, what type of new technologies we would need for that. But I would say it's not impossible. Maybe much more helicopters than fighter planes, that type of stuff. Secondly, we need civil defense. What the COVID crisis has also shown us is there is no defense of people. The most needed things, and the non-military threats, are something that nobody plans for. COVID was, in my view, not a health crisis. It was a security politics bankruptcy. Nobody had face masks. Nobody had equipment for the hospitals. What is that? Security. But we waste all the billions of dollars on military things. And the more we do that, the more we threaten others, and the more we increase the likelihood of warfare. Simple as that. So simple that politicians don't understand a word of it. And then 3, civil resistance. That is, if against your wishes and planning, you are going to be occupied, or dominated or encroached upon or whatever, what you do is you secure that the enemy, the occupier, will not be able to work with you. You deny the occupier cooperation, functioning of your society, etc. You mote it out because you cannot administer such a society where you don't have collaboration with the local people. So all this is, if you will, those who ask me, what would a good military and a good defense system look like? These are my 3-4 answers. But above all, defense is not the important thing. It is whether we can learn to handle in time conflicts with the least violence necessary, or with no violence at all. That is humanity's challenge number 1. Can we learn to clash? Can we learn to conflict, but not plan killing of each other? We've done away with slavery. We've done away with cannibalism. We've done away with absolute monarchy, etc. Can't we really not learn to be different? Because conflicts are good. That we are different is good. What is important is we learn to live in unity and with peace among diverse units. We will never be the same. And that's why, the US empire must go, because it has the idea that everybody should do the same. Finally, I see that time is running. This, of course, is unrealistic in the sense that the military-industrial media academic complex, MIMAC, will be against it. You can't sell weapons to such a system that I've outlined now. And of course, those who think the nuclear weapons are good, from China to the US, will also be against it. But there is no way humanity can survive in the long run without nuclear abolition. And that's why the treaty to do this is absolutely essential. And it's very sad to see that all the nuclear powers do not have the civil courage to say no to nuclear weapons, because this is now international law, and all those who have nuclear weapons are, in that sense, illegal states. And they build on the philosophy of terrorism, namely mass killing of civilians who are not party to a conflict. The biggest terrorism is not ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it's nuclearism. So I think there's all possibilities, such as, for instance, also the Pan-Schiller, the living together, the 5 principles. We got to think differently to create a better world and not be repressed in the short term about war threats. I know the situation is very terrible, and I'm a pessimist on a short range, but if we are able to get through this terrible crisis we're in now, the world could be such a beautiful place. And the United States will be a beautiful country the day it does not have an empire, and the world will be a better place when NATO and the US empire has gone, and we can work together, multi-party, multipolar, and cooperate instead of having confrontation, work on common visions instead of planning wars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Next, we will have Li Xing, who is the director of the Research Center on Development and International Relations at Aalborg University in Denmark. He has a PhD in that subject. He is a professor in the Department of Politics and Society and the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, as well as being an author. The word is yours. Okay.
First of all, I want to thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Schiller Institute in Denmark, for inviting me to be part of this seminar. I really learned a lot from the previous speakers' analysis, especially from Helga, from Jan, and from Jens, and especially Jens and Jan, both Jens or Jan, they are much more an experts on Ukraine case than me. What I'm going to do is that I'm trying to provide some perspective from the Chinese analysis, or from Chinese point of view. I remember Jens started by talking about that he became old, and the historical evolution of his experience, what he learned. And me too, when I came to Denmark, I was 25 years old, and now you can see my hairs are growing gray and white. At that time, it was in the 80s, and China was on the process of economic reform, very early stage, and China was very poor, measured by any dimensions. But today, China is much more advanced, much more developed, achieved great success on all dimensions. But somehow things become changed. At that time, 40 years ago, nobody regard China as a threat. But today, you can see the waves of Western media demonizing China, defaming China. So I'm thinking, what's wrong with that? It must be something changing, that because China's power that made the West very afraid, or any other reasons. There are many other, but Helga has contributed a lot of analysis. But anyway, return to the topic of today is about the international security order. To me, it's very important because I'm a professor in international relations. So I really think this topic is extremely important and actual. So first of all, I want to speak on Chinese position on the Ukraine war. Major Western media, they describe Chinese position as awkward. Perhaps it appears to be very awkward indeed. According to my interpretation, the Chinese position on Ukraine war has two sides. The Chinese regard the war, or Chinese position can be interpreted as a coin consisting of two sides. On the one side, it is about sovereignty, about territorial integrity. Of course, the war affects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. But on the other side of the coin, that it is exactly what Helga and Jens talk about, what are the factors that trigger Russia's behavior. Okay, did Russia's action represent the American style of preemptive self-defense? Because during the anti-terrorism wars, Americans used preemptive strike, preemptive self-defense as an argument, as a kind of defense for its war policy. Okay, so we have to understand why Chinese position is described as awkward. Okay, as being awkward, and we should not forget that just before the war, and China and Russia had this joint statement where both sides actually declared very clearly they are going to support each other for each other's national security concern. And for Russia, is the Ukrainian crisis, and for China, it is Taiwan issue. Okay, and both sides also agree that NATO's enlargement is regarded as circling around Russia, which means security concern for Russia. And both countries oppose US-led military camp or security camp in Asian Pacific as well. So you can see that the Chinese position consists of two aspects, but more kind of sympathetic on the Russian side. Okay, this is my interpretation. I also think that Helga's explanation about the flaw of current security structure, which is what she called geopolitics. Okay, it means geopolitics means that it's block of nations or nations that try to define or has to define its interest against another block of nations. Okay, so it means that when you form blocks, you feel secure, but you make the opponent part, the other side, feeling insecure. So this is the dilemma. And actually, I think that what Helga's point of view is quite echoed by Chinese President Xi Jinping's understanding of the flaw of international security order today. And what Xi Jinping recent in a conference, he called this type of block-based security structure is called, he called it group politics, bloc confrontation, small cycles. And you can see both Helga and Xi Jinping, the understanding of the flow of security architecture today is quite similar. So what exactly, if I want to offer some of the deep analysis, what is wrong with the current security structure? That is, if you look at on the left side, you have the NATO, and you can see NATO enlargement through all this historical period, okay, since 1990s. Then now we are talking about Finland and Sweden, okay? And now Denmark will vote on whether Denmark will be joining a European army, kind of independent security, but more or less is also within the same structure of NATO. It's group politics, bloc politics. On the right side, you can see that then we have other types of bloc-based security structure. You have Five Eyes, okay? Then within Five Eyes, you have AUKUS, 3 countries, UK, Australia, United States, okay? They form an even smaller group. Perhaps they think that Canada and New Zealand are not strong enough to resist China. Okay, maybe they are not trusted. So these 3 countries, they form even a smaller circle. Then you have the Quad. Okay, you have the India, US, Japan, Australia. They call it Indo-Pacific Security Dialogue. Biden was in South Korea a couple of days ago, and people begin to talk about whether South Korea should be part of Quad. Okay. But then these are multilateral. But then under multilateral blocks, then you also have bilateral blocks. You have Japan, US, South Korea, US. You have also Australia and US. All these are around China, trying to contain China in one way or another. So the key problem of this type of security structure is what we call security dilemma spiral, which means that countries begin to distract each other. If country A acts on something, then country B will strengthen its capacity to counteract country A. Then country A is confirmed by country B's action that country A needs to further invest on military means. So this is kind of dilemma spiral, very destructive. And the previous speakers have already explained that. Then if we look at international order, then we can see when we study international order, I think I'm professor of international relations, and many people in this audience, they understand international order. I think that when we talk about international order, we start with Westphalia, okay? And Helga also mentioned Westphalia in 1648. Westphalia Conference or Westphalia Order was regarded as the first international order, rule-based order. And 2 major principles, state sovereignty, territorial integrity, okay? And these 2 major principles were also written into United Nations Charter, okay? So after the Second World War, when the United States established, or allied country established in United Nations, together with Bretton Woods system, the United Nations Charter include these 2 basic principles. Unfortunately, after the Cold War, okay, US-led West, they felt extremely excited. They became totally this kind of, they are embedded in this triumphalism mentality. And this kind of a mentality was theorized or conceptualized by Fukuyama, the American political scientist, as end of history. Okay, now we should decide, okay, there are no alternatives. The American style liberal democracy, liberal capitalism is the only way out, okay? So Westphalia order doesn't care, it's not important. Then we see what is happening. Then we have the Yugoslavia bombing, Iraqi war, Color Revolution, Orange Revolution, Tulip Revolution, Rose Revolution, all these revolutions. Where are the basic principles of international order, sovereignty and territorial integrity? No, okay? These typical intervention-based revolutions. And now I'm feeling extremely puzzled. Now on the Ukraine war, every European countries, every Western country begin to talk about sovereignty, territorial integrity. Then I'm thinking, how about those revolutions, those interventionism? I remember during the color revolutions, all these revolutions, one of the arguments was that if the state leader, if they are not capable, if they did not comply with Western standard of democracy, human rights, they should be removed. Okay, and that's the same logic at maybe in Putin's mind, that if I feel Ukraine is creating a security dilemma for me, I'm going to remove it. Okay, so whether this is double standard. Okay, now we are moving to the future world order, which what will be the world order? I think there will be multi-order world. This is one of the projects I'm involved, and we get some fundings that we are theorizing the future world order, which will be multi-order, not one world order with different poles, but a multi-order group of countries aligned with one big power along culture, identity, history. Okay, so is that the world we are going to see? I don't know. So I think I need to emphasize what the solution from Chinese perspective. And President Xi Jinping made the speech at the Boao conference on April 20 and 22nd. He emphasized a few key points as part of his global security initiative. He pointed out the importance of common, comprehensive, cooperative, sustainable security, because the bloc-based security is not sustainable. He also pointed out that the bloc-based NATO is a product of the Cold War, so we should abandon Cold War mentality. We should oppose unilateralism, okay, and oppose global politics, okay, and peaceful settlement of crisis. And we should reject double standard. I just point out double standard, okay, and also we should oppose unilateral sanctions, okay. You know, the sanctions, the demonization of Russia is one issue, but sanction on Russia is another issue, because there is no United States, UN authorized sanctions. Okay, it is EU or West their own sanctions, and Chinese and Xi Jinping also made the point that non-interference in internal affairs is one of the principles. Okay, and I remember Yan talked about the 5 principles. This is one of the principles. Okay, and also that China proposed that we must build a balanced, effective, sustainable security architecture. Again, Eco, Helga, and Yan just talk about development, okay? And also that we must work together on dispute. So I'm not going to talk too much about, I think that this conference or this seminar was recorded from the beginning. So I think that the audience can read the slides later on. So the Chinese security concept, if I understand correctly, is strong nexus between security and development. So the security concept, in essence, is to rise above one-sided security and seek common security, okay? Through mutual benefit cooperation, okay? It is concept established on the basis of common interest and is conducive to social progress. And the Chinese perception is that there is no development without security, and there is no security without development either. This is the both way, okay? So China sees economic exchange interaction as an important avenue. So broadly speaking, the security development are intertwined. They cannot be separated. So if you look at the China's international relations, the majority and the key characteristics of Chinese external relations are economic and trade. If you look at all Chinese external relations, the majority of these relationships are economic and trade. Very little on security issues. For example, China's One Belt, One Road. okay, Helga also mentioned that if you look at the One Belt, One Road vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific strategy, the US-based Indo-Pacific is totally different. Okay, China's One Belt, One Road focus on transportation, infrastructure, trade, investment, energy, etc., whereas Indo-Pacific, the four countries, okay, India, US, and Japan, and Australia, they are about security, military, and defense. And recently, that Biden had a summit with ASEAN leaders, and it is obvious that ASEAN leaders refuse to choose sides because China is their largest economic partner. Okay, even though Australia has a new government, let's wait and see that whether Australia is going to change the positions of policy. So Belt and Road focus on connectivity. I remember that Jens and also Helga also talk about connectivity. It's extremely important, okay? And now China is building high-speed train in Southeast Asia, and perhaps it will spread around later on. And now in Asia, we have the largest trading bloc called RCEP. If you look at the statistics on the corner of the right side, you can see it is the biggest economic bloc, which means that free trade zone, okay? So these are China's ambition. These are China's vision and goals: economic development, economic change, trade, okay? And today, the result is very clear that China is the largest economic partner of 128 countries out of 190. Okay, including including the US close ally that are against China. Even those airlines, China is their largest economic partner. If you look at in the top middle, if you look at ASEAN, China is largest economic partner. If you look at Africa, Latin America, even European Union today, China is the European Union's largest trading partner. Even Quad, let's put Quad, okay, even Quad, okay, a kind of security alliance against China. Every country within Quad has China as its largest economic partner. This is the dilemma today. So you want to talk about economic decoupling? I don't think it's so easy. I don't think it's so easy, okay. So conclusion now is that economic development and security, they are intertwined and they are also embedded, okay. So the existing international architecture, security architecture, puts too much emphasis on military dimension. Unless the world prioritizes global poverty and development, long-term security can remain elusive. War in Ukraine generates arms spending in Europe, undermine development aid to world poorest countries. Now European countries begin to increase their arms spending and also increase spending on refugees in Europe, which imply that they will be even cutting in aid to the poorest countries. Look at the United States military budget, 813 billion this year under the Biden administration. And the United States international aid is only 4% of its military spending. So to me, I don't think the world will be peaceful without economic development. So conclusion is that economic development by far the best form of conflict prevention and conflict resolution. I think China is fighting for, the world is moving towards that position. I know China is not perfect. There are a lot of problems, a lot of mistakes, a lot of weakness we can discuss. But the major direction China is fighting for, I think, is optimal, is conducive to world peace. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Li Xing. Now we will have about 15 minutes for a question period. And if you would like to ask the question yourself, please press the raise hand function. And if you would like to write your question, put it in the question and answer in the Q&A function. So we have now, let's see, Svetlana from Denmark. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. And my regards to my friend, Jens Jørgen, and my Facebook friend, Jan Olberg. I remember, Jens, we were talking about necessity of making a conference where the experts of history and philosophy and political science from Russia and Denmark and whatever, the world can participate and discuss all these issues which come up, since I would say 2014, because of it's become more and more important, these issues. And it's, unfortunately nothing happened. And I mean that it's so important for people to talk to each other. And if, I'm sure that if we'll communicate more and between the countries, so a lot of issues will be solved, because of it's a huge amount of understandings, between the countries and the people, and even inside the countries. We can see it now. So I just, I think it's a very general question, because of the moment we're standing in a very, very dangerous, actually, situation where it's really look like a possibility of beginning of the Third World War. So, and Russia is isolated totally. So, but anyway, I'm looking forward for possible future. And it's a question to everybody on the panel, actually. Do you think it's possible to avoid the war and the total war? And do you think it's possible to continue such kind of conferences involving people, and especially, as I mentioned, historians and philosophers, experts in philosophy and political sciences, so they can discuss and find the answers for the questions what we are talking about. I mean, I think it's very general. I understand that it's...
let's start with Jens Jørgen.
Hi, Sveta. Good to hear from you. A very good remark you made here. I can just say, I absolutely agree with you, because it's even more necessary now than ever to have this contact. But for the time being, it's extremely difficult to have this contact. Everything has become very difficult. I can tell you that I have for many years been teaching at what we call the Open University of Copenhagen. And this autumn, I had in February, March, we have planned, I should have 10 lessons about Russian cultural history, 1,000 years. It means Russian Orthodox Church, icons. It means Russian painting, Dostoevsky literature, Tchaikovsky music, and so on, and some philosophy, Berdyaev, and so on and so on. It was cancelled beforehand. We should not have anything, the word Russian must not be in the catalogue. And I said, what country do I live in? Because it's absurd. But they are doing everything, to cut all ties between Russia and Denmark. And I think the same more or less goes for other countries as well. And it's a very dangerous thing, because if you do not have any contact, it's much easier also to have enemy images. It's much easier to conceive of the other people as an enemy. It goes for us in the West. And of course, it also goes for people in Russia who will never see, almost not see a person from the West. So to have this common, conscious that we are human beings. We are different. Our histories are different and our culture are different, but we are one human species here on the planet. And we should accept also other cultures, be they Chinese, Russian, or Arab, or whatever they mean. Otherwise, well, we are bound for war. And war today is not like even war in the Second World War and First World War, but war today is maybe extension of human race. So it's really important to have this context. I have contacts with people in Russia from universities where I've been some years back also, and they're very fruitful. But there's no official cultural exchange policy whatsoever between Denmark and Russia. And I think it's awful. I think it's a totally wrong thing to do. It's really now, in this time close to war, we have to develop this kind of things. So thank you for the remark. I think it's very relevant and it's very timely. And I will do my tiny small contribution to keep on talking with the Russian historians, which I know a few of them, philosophers and things like that.
Yes, I would like to ask Helga if you have any comments or any questions to the three panelists.
No, but I just would like one thought to what was said just now, and that is that the witch hunt is not just against Russian artists and scientists and everybody Russian. Look what they did, what they're doing to former Chancellor Schröder in Germany. I mean, this is a complete disgrace. You know, I mean, Schröder did one thing good when he was a chancellor, and that is when he prevented Germany from participating in the Iraq war in 2003. So that, in my view, has gained him, you know, some unchangeable merit, and you should not. I mean, there was in the SPD a discussion, an agreement that nobody should have contact with him. Can you imagine, with your own chancellor, and even the people like the present leader Klingbeil, he said that they will now completely review the relationship with Russia, that they basically say everything was wrong. The Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr was all wrong, and that now they will develop relations to the East European countries, meaning the Baltic and Poland. These are all raving anti-Russian countries because of reasons which one could explain. It has a lot to do with foreign influence in these countries. But this is disgusting. You know, I mean, the reason why Germany has a peaceful unification in 1990 was the result of the Brandt détente policy, of the Egon Bahr policy, Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. And these people have no backbone. I mean, even the former USO leader Kühnert, he was supposedly pro-peace. Now he's completely on the NATO line. I mean, it's disgusting. These people have been brainwashed, and I think it's very, very bad. Now, because of what Svetlana was asking and Jens was answering, I mean, I thought that maybe we could organize a virtual Zoom conference or other conference where we would have a dialogue among philosophers and artists and scientists with Russia. I think that we could try to do. I don't know what you think about it, but I think that would be one way of countering this complete, you know, ridiculous behavior and very dangerous behavior. So maybe we should toss this idea around if we cannot not organize a big symposium, including emphatically many people from Russia.
Okay, I have three questions for Jan Erber. One is, there's a statement from Elliot from YouTube who wants to know why Jan Erber isn't president. I don't know if they mean of United States or maybe or of Denmark or Sweden. But two other questions. One is, Jan, what do you have to say about the Danish referendum and the question of if Denmark should join the EU military activities? And then the second question is, how do you, from YouTube, how do you feel about having diplomatic debates in front of the public, actual diplomatic discussions, and end closed door talks?
I'm not sure I got the last one.
Okay, but you, it's a question about if there, instead of having behind the curtain diplomatic discussions, if there should be, if the diplomatic discussions should be publicized openly.
Okay. Well, first of all,
maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just say about an earlier question. If I understood it correctly, can we avoid war? Yeah, that's very easy. NATO just declares tonight that it will not make Ukraine a NATO member. I think that would be pretty easy. They're not going to do it, but that would stop much of it, and it would also kind of, you know, disarm once and for all the invasion in Ukraine. Secondly, I'm all for people-to-people meetings, and I think the modern technology should be used for this. I agree completely with Helga. We should try to do some much more dialogues between Russians of different kinds and Westerners or the rest of us, because people must not keep on hating each other. As long as people hate each other, they will accept hateful politics. And third, I would like to say, get rid of the censorship. The Western, the EU decided that we cannot access Russian media, such as Russia Today, which, by the way, I work with whenever I can, also in a way to do dialogue. And, you know, you have to have a proxy server. Now, this is a violation of the Social and Political Rights Charter of 1966. It's simply a violation of human rights. Every human being has a right to gather freely information and build his and her own opinions about things. Now, the West is undermining its own principles and human rights. And of course, there's no free press left in the mainstream area. And finally, of course, also, yes, cooperate with academics. I am not at Lund University. I left it at 89 here in town, but it immediately decided on the order of the Minister of Education in Sweden months ago that you should stop having any cooperation with Russian scholars. And that is no longer a free university that takes political orders. It reminds me of the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s. So about the Danish referendum, let me quickly say, I don't think it matters much. I have written 2 small booklets about 10 years ago. There is nothing in the action or in the Lisbon Treaty that makes the European Union work for peace in the world, except in its preamble, where it says something like unity and diversity, and the main thing the European Union should contribute to is peace inside the Union and peace in the world. I haven't seen that. The only time it has had a common policy spoken with one voice was when they recognized Slovenia and Croatia out of Yugoslavia, which was illegal. But worse, as some of us predicted, it would release the war, make war in Bosnia unavoidable. And that's exactly what happened 5 months later. So much for that. Whether you participate in a few missions, more or less, in Africa is not very important. The whole organization is wrongly constructed from a peace point of view and a conflict resolution point of view and reconciliation point of view and non-violence point of view. And so I agree with those who say it will anyhow basically be NATO that runs the show. And that's why that should be closed down. Because it runs a bad show, and NATO has existed since '49 and has, if you haven't by means of taxpayers' money been able to create the peace you promised and which is in your treaty, I mean, I think from 49 till today is enough to prove whether you can do it or you cannot do it. NATO cannot create peace. It has never been able to. It's a confrontational, non-defensive alliance promoting power politics. So, and finally, open diplomacy. Yes, I think that's sometimes a good thing, but I would much rather have citizens diplomacy. One of the reasons the old Cold War broke down was that tons of people, among them Quakers, went incognito and a private capacity and spoke with people in flats and collected samizdat literature and all that. Humans to humans, diplomacy, we also have an organization for diplomacy between Russians and Americans. That's a very important thing, that we begin as citizens to act as though we are diplomats and promote peace. And we do it concretely. It's not just a matter of demonstrations in the streets in each place. It's also contact with those who are appointed enemies, because human beings around the world are not our enemies. Maybe some governments are. So that's one thing. And I do believe that there should be a space also for what you call diplomacy in the traditional sense, people meeting and there are no journalists present. There are things that have to be set in negotiations, in explorations of peaceful solutions, etc. And maybe you really want not to have 300 journalists waiting in the press conference afterwards to tell what you've been doing. As long as the result, the intention and the result is to make the world a more peaceful place, I would accept that as traditional diplomacy is important. My problem is that most diplomats do not know what peace is. They're not educated in it. Ministries of Foreign Affairs have no experts in peace helping them. They have lawyers and military people and political scientists. And that's one reason it goes as madly as it does at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have many more questions, but I will postpone them to the last question period. But we have one last question here. This is from Lars Jonsson. Please unmute, Lars.
Lars Jonsson here.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, Lars Jonsson, Swedish, retired in Aachen, Germany, 37 years in pharma industry. Question to the last speaker here, and thank you for excellent presentations. Obviously, we are discussing at the political level, and I agree with most of what you say. However, how can unbridled weapon industry capitalism be curbed in a situation like this? The weapon industry, like the industry where I've self been operating, thousands of lobbyist experts at their disposal. And like in the Vietnam War, Middle East, Ukraine, the American and also European weapon industry lobbying play English as well, play a key role. What my specific question is to the last speaker, Mr. Erber. What capacities do you see amongst current future political leaders to curb the power of the weapon industry with all its implications from an employment viewpoint, financial viewpoint, and a political viewpoint? Please, Mr. Erber, and thank you for your presentation, and thank you, moderator, Mrs. Moderator as well.
You want me to answer now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind words. What I operate with in the prolongation of what Eisenhower mentioned in his farewell speech, I think in 63 or 61, whenever it was, I'm forgetting it, where he talked about the military-industrial complex as something growing outside democratic control, and it would take over America's political system if it was not brought under control. Now, it has certainly not been brought under control, and that's also why you can really question whether the United States is a democracy in any serious sense of the word. My problem with it is that it must, including defense industries and how things are produced for defense, must be brought under the control of parliaments. At the moment, they are the ones who are earning money, profiting from, the merchants of death. are profiting from this, and which we ought to have a discussion about, the following fact, that military production is detrimental and harmful, if you will, to the rest of the economy. It's a few companies that earn. And of course, if you produce a new sophisticated weapon system and you get $100 billion for it, then of course you earn in that company. But the rest of the economy is losing a potential for civilian development, for housing, for healthcare, for culture, etc., because money is going the wrong way into a very capital-intensive production type, meaning less employment, etc. So all the military is a cancer on the political system and a cancer on the economic system. And that is something we should have a discussion about. And they are driving these things, of course, because the military industrial, blah, 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 media academic complex has to do with elites who are together in earning money and earning fame and gaining synergy from destruction. And we need a discussion about what role does that play and how do we get that under democratic control? Because if Biden, for instance, or Johnson or whatever is run actually by military interests, then it's no longer reasonable to talk about a democracy. And that's what I, with my nasty mind, think is the case. But it is a cancer. And the argument that it's good with military investments for the economy in general is there's no theory, there's no book, there's no analysis ever made that proves that point. Conversion from the military to the civilian industry is what we need. And the Swedish UN ambassador, Inga Thorsson, did that in the 80s and was ridiculed by her own party. That was a huge UN investigation that proved that it's easy to transform military industries into civilian high-tech in different forms and shapes. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to introduce Ulf Sandmark, who is the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Sweden and very long time cooperator with Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Well, thank you for this. I actually am a co-host in one way for this. I also would like to thank everyone for these contributions, these excellent contributions that we had before here. I would try to answer the question why Sweden should not join NATO. Actually, the applications were unnecessary. They were reckless. They were insane. They were unnecessary because there was no threat against Sweden or Finland because Russia was busy on other fronts in Ukraine, and also there was no intention from Russia to attack our countries. It was also reckless because it increases the threats to Russia in violation of the OSCE treaty, especially the principle of inclusive security, because you are not allowed to increase your own security at the cost of others, according to the treaty. Actually, this is also the UN treaty. And furthermore, it was also reckless because we have established now a line of confrontation in the north. It used to be in the Cold War a very strong confrontation line on the continent with big armies standing against each other in Germany and so on. But now we will have this same line of confrontation in the north and make the whole area an area of instability. And especially the Baltic Sea will be blocked with the policy, American policy called 2AAD, the area denial policy. So this is now discussed in the Swedish Royal Academy of Military Academy. So what we have now is also an insane policy because it was an absolute immense nuclear provocation. Possibly it is a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. Already now, American B-52 strategic bombers are allowed into Sweden. I can maybe share this screen here. Because these pictures are from January 18, February 18, where Swedish fighters were escorting US B-52 Stratofortress bombers task force on the airspace over southern Sweden. This was actually not only one B-52, it was two. Each one can carry 12 Tomahawk missiles. Each missile can carry a nuclear warhead. This means that these B-52 bombers flying from Britain into Swedish territory could, within minutes from Swedish territory, extinguish 24 Russian cities. It was a huge provocation. It was actually the same time as the increase of attacks against Donbass was done by 30 times. So this is the real danger. And as Jan Erber suspected, it was a planned attack to bring Sweden into NATO. It was like an ambush, because the Swedish former Minister of Defense, Sven Tolgfors, has written in a book that we cannot have Sweden join NATO now, but in a crisis, for security, we must be prepared to make it very swift. So this was already prepared in that way he described it. So, and we also see how it came about. It was just in a few weeks, out of fear and hysteria, Sweden shifted and Finland shifted. And this sudden shift is now a shock to the Swedish people. What was true a month ago or 2 months ago is now false. 2 months ago, Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson said Swedish NATO membership would destabilize the region. Now the Swedes are supposed to be reprogrammed by the mass media pressure. And as this habit of the Swedes are to be the best in the class, like a master of groupthink, just like Jan Erber also mentioned, now Sweden is expected to be the best in the class for war against Russia and China. So we are in a huge identity crisis among the Swedes, and especially among social democratic voters. Turkey's opposition sets an example to the lack of sovereignty in NATO. The US is now supposed to fix the problem. So where is the much heralded freedom of sovereignty NATO is supposed to defend? The Swedes are shocked to see the treatment of Turkey now, when the US is supposed to put the pressure on them. Actually, Turkey is now defending the Swedish and Finnish sovereignty more than our own governments. Hopefully, more NATO member nations will join Turkey. It will at least give us more time here in Sweden to stop this insanity. By blocking our NATO application, Turkey is actually defending all of NATO and the world against a huge nuclear weapons crisis. Turkey is actually the grown-up in the room in its organizing peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, something Sweden and Finland should have concentrated its diplomatic efforts on instead of joining NATO. However, Sweden and Finland should take our destiny in our own hands. We must re-establish our former common mission for peace and economic development. We should take part in the establishment of a new architecture for security and development for all nations, replacing geopolitics and the robbery of high finance against our nations. NATO has run us over. Together with other nations in the world, now we can make NATO obsolete and bury it. The first step should be, for Sweden and Finland, should be to join with the peace proposal of Italy's Prime Minister Draghi, who has proposed now a peace proposal for Ukraine. Possibly this kind of international cooperation could pull in Turkey also in this kind of peace negotiation and pressure for peace. Secondly, we have to bring in the economic dimension, because this could decide the whole choice of security policy for Sweden and for Finland and not joining NATO. It's also for the whole of Europe. We need to start to counter the sanction economic shockwave. It is a neoliberal shock therapy on steroids, throwing the people into direct misery. It's an evil looting to unload the financial debt bubbles on the back of the population, industry, middle class, making millions poor in the West, bringing massive starvation to the developing nations. So actually the financial bubble and the looting they will do with that is even bigger than the military industrial complex looting, and also as unproductive. What we have is the proposal by Zepp-LaRouche of the 4 laws to halt this neoliberal shock therapy. We should stop the central bank money printing for bailing out the failing financial system. We should have a Glass-Steagall bank separation and refuse paying the speculation bubbles. We should re-establish banks as banks for productive credit with this bank separation. And then we can put forward a National Bank for Development issuing productive credit. Helga was into this proposals. I want to point to them again, because this can be absolutely the center of the resistance to this war policy. What we need are regulations now to address the emergencies in food, energy, and electricity. We used to have a regulated electricity system here in Sweden with a very low and secure power supply. We could go back to that. We can go back to regulations for food and all the supplies for farming and for the industry that is connected to the food production, and also for the energy, actually for the whole economy. What is the importance is to have the people first principle, to protect housing, protect production, because in this financial crash, many people will go out of business, will go out of business, and many people will lose their houses if they are supposed to pay interest in a runaway inflation. So what we need is the freezing of rents and debt payments will be, and this will be necessary to protect the people in production. We need to fight inflation the real way, to invest in the most advanced technology with high energy density to increase productivity. This is the real way to stop production, to stop inflation. So actually now, we have a situation now in Sweden where half the population are angry over the betrayal by their establishment and the government. There is an election coming now in Sweden on September 11. There should be huge changes that can and must block the NATO membership and resist the war drive against Russia and China. So we have this opportunity to use the uproar among the population now because of the economic crisis to stop this NATO membership. So this is our big chance now, and we should strive to work for this. And Sweden and Finland should strive for not being best in the NATO class for war and financial looting, but best in the class for peace and development. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Ulf. I will just take a few minutes to speak about the Danish situation, standing in for Tom Gillesberg, the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Denmark. But before I do that, we have many questions. I will only speak for about 5 minutes, but I would ask if as many of the panelists as possible would be able to stay on another 15 minutes, that we extend the discussion to 16:45 instead of cutting it off at 16:30. So the Schiller Institute in Denmark is definitely saying that people in the referendum, which is to be held on June 1st, should vote no. The referendum concerns a situation where after the Ukraine war, then 5 parties in the Danish government voted to have a referendum as part of a national defense compromise, including the Socialist People's Party, which had organized the opt-outs in the beginning, back in at the time of 1992, where the Danish population had first voted no to the Maastricht Treaty. And then when the negotiations in the Edinburgh Agreement came up with 4 opt-outs, then the population voted yes to accept the Maastricht Treaty. One of the opt-outs was that Denmark would not participate in the joint European EU military activities. We think that people should vote no. This would be a way not only to prevent Denmark from increasing its military activity with the EU, but would also put a stop to a process of militarization that has been going on, especially since 2001. Personally, I originally am American. I'm American citizen, and recently I also became a Danish citizen. And I would say that Denmark, my adopted country, ought to, instead of just following along with the policies of the United States, my native country, that Denmark should instead work to change the policies of the United States. Lyndon LaRouche had many years ago called for a 4-power agreement. If United States, Russia, China, and India would cooperate to establish a new just world economic system, a new credit system, this could be the basis through economic development, cooperation of conflict resolution. As Li Xing was saying, the best alternative to war is to get the economic cooperation going. Since 2001, Denmark has participated in every war that the United States, goaded on by the British, have launched, from Afghanistan under Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, Prime Minister, and it was especially the militarization was escalated with the Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who later became the NATO General Secretary. This was joining in the wars in Iraq, and then we had Libya, we had the other wars that came after that. And now Denmark is in negotiations with the United States for setting up a bilateral defense treaty, which will probably include permanent stationing of United States troops on Danish soil, which would be for the first time in peacetime that foreign troops would be permanently stationed here. There was a question to the 5 parties that came up with this national compromise, defense compromise, a question from a reporter to the 2 right parties, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, what would they say if the United States would ask for negotiating about stationing of nuclear weapons in Denmark? And their answer was, well, we'll have to talk about it. So this is also a total reversal of Danish policy beforehand. And the other thing is that it's not enough to vote no. That will not solve the problems, but it will be a way of stemming the tide of this step by step militarization, because what the Schiller Institute is saying is that the key to a more peaceful world is not increasing the militarization, but it is establishing a new security and economic development architecture where you can avoid the outbreak of war. You can avoid the, as Jan Erber was saying, that you can have conflicts, but how do we make sure that it doesn't go to war? How can we solve these conflicts in a peaceful way? And that is where the idea of the Peace of Westphalia approach, which I will soon ask a question to Helga to explain more about that. And Denmark has also had a different tradition. One of our slogans here has been, instead of war fighting, bridge building, a Danish tradition for economic development partnership with countries, about water development, about building bridges, about energy development. And this is what we need to be emphasizing. So I would like to introduce then the question period by asking the question to Helga. Let me just get it here. Yes, this is from Sarah on YouTube, who would like to ask Helga, what is a foreseeable path to reaching a position to propose the Peace of Westphalia? Is war the only way? How much can transparency work towards reaching this goal? What is the idea of, and I asked you, Helga, to sum it up, what is the idea of the Peace of Westphalia? How can this be, these principles of peace building be used today, and how can we actually implement this?
Well, I mean, obviously we have the problem right now that from the side of NATO, the EU, the United States, global Britain, comes this policy of confrontation against Russia and China. And then you have on the other side the new alliances and partnerships which are forming, who would be completely open. And actually, you know, China invited the United States and Europe many times to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative, but, you know, this did not find a positive answer. So the only pathway I can see right now is that, you know, we have to present the option of a new paradigm of, you know, a plan how to actually solve the pressing problems of the world, like the world famine, which will become, you know, this will become really a huge question. You look at countries like Lebanon right now, which are completely falling apart because people cannot afford the prices for food anymore. You have long lines in front of bakeries. People have no medicine. The situation in Afghanistan is absolutely horrendous. And Yemen and Syria, and you know, you can make a very long list of countries who just don't make it anymore. So our idea is basically that we have to create a partnership of forces in the world who are demanding that, you know, a new paradigm be implemented. I don't think we will have any problem with the non-aligned countries. But the big problem is how to convince people in Europe and in the United States that that is the pathway. So this is why we plan to organize an ongoing series of Schiller conferences like we had on April 9th, where we had a very, very representation of, you know, different countries. We had Ambassador Antonov from the Russian ambassador in the United States. We had several former ministers from the bloc, the non-aligned movement, India, South Africa, Latin America. So we plan to have another such conference mid-June. And I ask all of you to help building this, because this is not just a question of attending the conference, but, you know, to actually help organizing it. Reach out to all the people you know, bring them in on board, because I'm convinced that only if we organize a increasing chorus of people demanding that the policy be changed in the direction we are discussing here, that there is a chance that we can bring the West on board. I don't think the developing countries have any problem to, want to have a new world economic order which guarantees their survival. So I'm really asking you to become organizers for the implementation, rather than being sitting on the fence and looking how it goes. You should take it as your own responsibility to make this function, because I think only if a lot of people in many, many countries get on board and fight for this, does it have a chance.
I have two questions for Li Xing. One is from an engineer in Africa, Munashi. He asked, how can Africa deal with geopolitics given the growing expansionism of the so-called alliances for democracy? How can we tell the world to stop focusing on militarism and engage in global development initiatives? And then there was another question about what should be done if China, the workers in China have lower salaries and the people in the West have higher salaries and more humane working environment. How can the West compete on in a global market?
Should I answer now?
Yes, and there was another part of the question that saying that alleging that the Chinese have non-existing labor rights.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think that these are two separate issues. If I'm going to answer the question, first on Africa facing geopolitics, that's true. Because that not only Africa, also China's neighboring countries, Southeast Asia, they are also being forced to choose sides. Okay, and in the African continent, Africa is part of the China's Maritime Belt Road project, and China had a lot of investment there, and Africa is also had a very difficult situation today that facing. One is traditional power, one is existing emerging power. So I think that Africa is facing a lot of questions on its relation with China. On the one side, there are a lot of advances and achievements from the cooperation between Africa and China. On the other side, there are also a lot of criticisms, a lot of even demonizations from the West on African-China relationship. For example, a debt trap, or for example, repeat of dependent explanations. That's true. I would argue that yes, that if you look at the statistics, you will find that yes, indeed, that China export more finished product, import more raw material. In that sense, it's a more kind of a traditional neo-colonial relationship according to the statistics. But I think that China also do some other ways to compensate the situation in a way, for example, to give up some of the debt, and also to provide more kind of investment aid from other perspectives. So you can see that there are still ways to solve problems, but Africa should not be kind of burdened or should not be blind-minded by these so-called new colonial, new imperial discourses. Even there are some flaws, even if there are some, spaces for further improvement. But China-Africa relations is very important. Africa has two options now. Traditionally, Africa only has the West. Today, China has also another partnership possibility. So Africa actually is in a good position now to make choice. Okay, so which is the best partnership. But on the labor issue, I think that was true in the 1980s. I would argue. In the 1980s, that the Chinese basic economic model was based on cheap labor and poor conditions, and there are many literature already on that. I don't need to repeat. Okay, but today, the situation is completely different. That today, actually, according to my statistics, the Chinese wage is rising even higher than its productivity. So many of the Chinese light industries based in Southeast China has been moving, abroad. It means that the labor wages are increasing, and also securities and also treatment are being also improved under the government regulation. You are not allowed to pay less. Once you hire someone, you have to do like the Danish system, that you have to provide pensions, holidays, and some other conditions. So the situation is different from today, from the 30, 40 years ago.
Thank you. Now we have, before the next question, I would just like to say, if you want to ask a question yourself, please press the raise hand function. If you want to write your question, put it in the Q&A function. So now we have a question from Elena from Italy. Please unmute, Elena.
Forse ora, can you listen?
Okay, go ahead.
It was closed. I was saying that I want to go back to Mr. Nielsen, because when he spoke about Russia that was left out from the NATO, that problem is one of the problems that also I have spoken about many times, because I remember that whenever Russia was asking to get into the NATO, that was not, she was left out. This has been done also when Russia was on the point of entering the European Union, because I remember when the Prime Minister Berlusconi, when Bush was on office, he had tried to let Russia get into Europe, because it is very important that Russia comes into Europe, because if we have Russia left out, there will never be peace in Europe. Because why we do not have to consider Russia as a European country? Russia is Europe, is not Chinese. When they speak about Russia and Chinese, they are very dangerous. This is not true, because Russia has the same cultural, can share with Europe, or culture, history, music, religion, and everything. They are our major sister. So this is one thing that I would like to fight for. Whenever I have been in the European Union for 9 years, and I have left it because I did not agree with the policy of this European Union, because European Union has no chance to be independent, to say what she really thinks. It depends only on the deep state. So this is one of the reasons that I fight for Russia. I want Russia to become a member of the European Union, together with all the other countries, because you remember that 14 countries from the Eastern Europe has entered the European Union. Why then we don't have to give this chance also to Russia? So this is what I believe, and I will fight for this. So if also with the organization, we want really peace, we have to be all together, even Ukraine, because Ukraine is not a sovereign country. So Ukraine has been somehow occupied by the NATO, by CIA, by the deep state, and they have been stolen lots of resources that this country has got. They have recently bought 18 millions of hectares of land. So if Ukraine is a poor country, why don't we help Ukrainian instead of spending money on weapons? I stop because I've been speaking too much. So thank you very much.
Helga, do you have a response, please?
I think this is absolutely right. However, I would just add that I think we have reached, from the standpoint of universal history, the point where we have to make the jump to include everybody. Because, this question, we should be with Russia, but not have Russia with China. I think that's the wrong thinking. And I really think that we need to have an approach, looking at where should the human civilization be in 100 years from now? Do we in 100 years from now still want to have geopolitical confrontation? If everything goes right, we will have thermonuclear fusion power. This will solve all energy and raw material problems. We will be space traveling. We will have a village on the moon. We will start building a city on Mars. All of this requires that we work together internationally like one humanity. And I think that is the step we have to make. The Chinese are perfectly happy to work with every country. I think Russia does the same thing. In the best tradition of the United States, John Quincy Adams, for example, his foreign policy was also to be part of an alliance of sovereign republics. The best traditions of Europe were like that. So I think we have to make the jump and really start with the one human race, and then have national interest after that. I think that's the mental evolutionary step we have to make if we want to come out of this crisis.
I have another question for Helga from the YouTube chat. There were actually two questions I'll put together. One, it concerns the question of political leadership in the West. One of the questions was saying, how can we hold people accountable for the wrong policies, the dangerous policies that they have been pursuing? And at the same time, the other question was, how can so-called sane proposals be implemented by the insane Anglo-American oligarchy and their puppets? But I would put the question, what is necessary of political change in Europe and the United States, and how can we achieve that?
Well, the Swedish Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, they just put out a report where they said that you have this combination of crises and the political establishment is seemingly totally incapable of dealing with it. And I think that's very clear, mainly because they are so arrogant that they think they are so good and so, excellent that they don't need to review of why we are in this crisis. So they will not change. Now that brings the question of where should the solution come from? And I think it has to come from a secondary leadership, because in all kinds of functions, you have excellent people who are engineers, farmers, teachers, have all kinds of other medical professions. And they are normally not taking political leadership because they either are specialists or they're whatever reasons they have. I think we have to catalyze a new movement of secondary leadership who takes responsibility, because most politicians are so, and I think one of the speakers before was saying it, you know, they're so mediocre, they're so uneducated, so arrogant, and the combination of stupidity and pride is a very dangerous cocktail. And we have to educate people in the secondary leadership to now step forward and, you know, join with the Schiller Institute, because in all modesty, you know, I mean, what we represent is the only international organizations which proposes solutions. And I think that is what people have to be educated about. Why do we emphasize so much Glass-Steagall? You know, because we will head towards an inflationary blowout of the financial system. And, you know, that can become very hairy. And the only medicine against that is to have an end to the present casino economy, because, you know, it's not just the military industrial complex which is the problem. It's Wall Street, it's the City of London, it's Silicon Valley, and, you know, it's the combination of the military industrial complex, the intelligence community, the media, the think tanks, and the financial centers who have formed like a symbiosis of evil. And you have to end that system by imposing Glass-Steagall. You have to basically bring the credit policy back under the control of sovereign governments and people. So I would say we have to educate people in secondary positions, but being top in their own profession, to step forward and become political leaders, because they normally are much more competent than the so-called professional politicians. So that is what you should help to make happen.
So we're coming up to the end of our seminar. Helga, do you have any other final words?
Well, I don't want to miss to say that tomorrow we have another very important conference of the Schiller Institute, which will have very prominent speakers. Senator Richard Black from the United States, who is a patriot, Republican, but very outspoken in his criticism of the present US policy. Then we have Ray McGovern, who many people in Europe know because he's one of the founders of the Veterans for Sanity in Intelligence. This is a group of whistleblowers and, you know, people who used to be part of the security apparatus, but who have distanced themselves from it because they don't agree with the present policies. Then we have the former head of the Italian Air Force, General Tricarico, who is every day in Italian TV, and he has, for example, his response to the Swedish and Finland application to join NATO. He said this is completely insane. This is putting like a finger again in the eye of Putin. So he's very outspoken, and you should listen to him. And we have Eric Denisset, who is the head of a French think tank, and he speaks not only for himself, but for the majority of the French military who are opposing the present position of Macron being in NATO. So this will be a continuation, in a sense, of the discussion today. So you should help to organize that, and that should also be a stepping stone towards our conference mid-June, where I really again want to repeat, wherever you are, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, help to build this alliance of people who fight for a better system.
Thank you very much. I just want to add one addendum to my speech that I forgot before we end here, which is that there are some voices in Denmark who are warning that if we continue in the way that we are risking nuclear war, including a former Brigadier General Michael Clemmensen, who in an article in Berlingske Tidende came out saying that, quote, "The simple truth is that we are up against the world's greatest nuclear power in Russia, and there are therefore limits to how great a defeat you can inflict on them before it becomes extremely dangerous with the risk of an all-out nuclear war. We need to be very careful about the bloodlust, and that's not a risk I dare to take. I have grandchildren. And he actually called for United States and China to lead the way to having an understanding to get a ceasefire. And then he called for a Korean type solution of just making the ceasefire and then negotiating. So I want to thank you all, speakers and participants, for making this a very productive event. And you can help build the movement for a new security and development architecture by spreading the video of this seminar, by staying in contact with us. We will have a transcript of Helga's speech later today that I will send around to everybody. And we have to find out about the other speeches. And let us ensure that we do everything we can to, as Beethoven put it, relieve needy humanity during this crucial moment in world history. So thank you again. Thank you to Helga and Jens Jørgen, Jan, Li Xing, Ulf, and thank you to all the people who asked questions, written or verbally, and for those who were following the conference. So thank you very much. As Helga said, now you have some homework to do to spread this conference and to help us organize for the future conferences so that we can actually create a new international security and development architecture for the benefit of all people. Thank you.
Thank you.